Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the third middle school community forum. This evening, we're going to review much what we've done the previous couple of forums, but times change. There's more to report. So we're going to look once again at where we've been, an update as to where we are today. And certainly people want to know where we're going with this. And this evening, you'll be hearing from Brian Jarvis and Tony Pena from Compass Project Management. Dr. Goff will give you an update, and you'll hear from Chris Blesson from Tape Architects. So as I said, where we've been, where we are, and where we're going with the project. So thank you all very much for coming tonight. And with that, I believe I'll turn it over to Brian Jarvis.
Yep. Thanks, Mark. Welcome, everyone. And as Mark mentioned, we're going to do a brief overview. Some of you that have joined some of the previous forums have seen some of these slides. We have updates on those, as well as some new information regarding potential options for a middle school project. If you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to type them in the chat. We will have a Q&A session at the end, and we'll try to get to everyone's questions and answers. As far as an agenda goes, we'll do a quick timeline review, overall project and how it relates to the MSBA process, the current status of the project and where we are, an overview of the decision-making process that we've been using on the project regarding options, how we started to generate some options, the enrollment decision, as you may have heard on the previous community forum, talking about a single school or a combined school, how that decision affected options, the evaluation process that we put in place to start evaluating those options with the school building committee, and finally arriving at a short list of options, which we are down to the final 3 options that we need to decide between by the end of February and get that into the MSBA. Then we'll have a question and comment session at the end. Next slide. So for some of you, you've probably seen this slide before. Nothing has changed. We're currently in the feasibility schematic design of the process. That's where we're gathering information and coming up with feasible options that the town could pursue for their middle school project. The goal is to finish the feasibility study phase, which has a couple deliverables that we'll get into with the MSBA, and get those done by the end of this February. And the goal for the end of February is really to come up with the one option that the town elects to move forward to do a further design and move it into schematic design. And schematic design is really where you come up with that initial in-depth concept renderings and the initial budget and schedule that gets submitted into the MSBA by the end of August. And that's the information that the town will then get into the next agreement with the MSBA, and would be presented to a town meeting and to a town vote, right now tracking to the fall of 2021. If that moves forward on that schedule, design phase and bidding phase would happen starting in the fall of 2022, basically through the winter of 2022, getting us up to a construction start late 2022, and then possibly wrapping up in the summer of 2024. Again, totally dependent on the option and the schedule and the phasing associated with whatever construction project is approved. Next slide. So this is that schedule. The blue represents the feasibility schematic phase, which is due by the end of February for the PSR submittal, and then also by August for the schematic design. We've updated the status bar, the red bar, getting us to January of this year. We submitted the preliminary design plan. We talked about that at previous forums, which the big component of that was the educational program, how Walpole wants to deliver middle school education, and the space summaries, basically taking that plan, converting it into square footage on the different types of spaces that you might need in a school to deliver that plan. That submittal went in the end of November. We're now moving towards a preferred schematic report, PSR, which is getting all of that information into options and then narrowing those options down to one preferred option that goes to the MSBA, and then wrapping up this summer with a schematic design report ahead of a possible town meeting and a ballot vote this fall. Next slide. These are the deliverables that were highlighted. Previous forums talked about some of these in depth. We submitted the preliminary design program, as I mentioned, on time at the end of November. We received comments back from the MSBA just before the holidays, and we responded to those comments right after New Year's by the 14th of January. We're currently in the yellow deliverable, which is the preferred schematic report. The key takeaways from this deliverable was a final decision regarding the enrollment. And some of you may have heard school committee elected at their meeting on December 10th to go with a combined middle school and a combined educational program, so that both the Johnson and the Byrd would be consolidated into one school. Looking at conceptual options and shortlisting options, the school building committee has been hard at work going through options analysis with potential solutions, and then narrowing that down to 3 options, which you'll see tonight. They did that at their January 5th meeting. And then final options analysis and evaluation. Part of that process is going through more due diligence on those 3 remaining sites, meeting with different town boards, committees, gathering feedback from residents in the community, which is why we're doing a forum tonight. And then finally arriving at a preferred solution. At the end of this month, the building committee really wants to vote on that preferred solution at the meeting on the 26th. That allows TAPE and the architect team to further develop that one option and submit that to the MSBA by the end of February, which would keep us on schedule. And the goal of that PSR is really to come up with the most cost-effective and educationally appropriate solution for the town. That submittal will include conceptual floor plans, a conceptual site plan, and a conceptual total project budget. So a little bit more detail than what we have right now, but really get an idea of what that solution might look like. Next slide. So one of the first presentations and one of the first forums, we went through the decision-making process that we like to put in place on projects. Really aligns with how the MSBA likes to do their projects as well, with how you get to a preferred solution. It's a lot of work in a relatively short amount of time to look at all those options and then eventually narrow it down. But we kind of use the funnel analysis. The goal is that you generate options, come up with as many options as you think are feasible. And again, we're in the feasibility stage. You know, what project or what concept is actually feasible, and then you look at whether or not that makes the most sense. And some of them obviously will make more sense than others. Given the agreement with the MSBA, there were 7 possible scenarios for Walpole based upon the enrollment. So obviously, if you stuck with a single middle school of 450 student enrollment, there were several options that could come from that. There was also several options that came from a combined enrollment of 905, and they included everything from just renovating the existing Byrd to additions and renovations for both sides schools, and also new schools for both sides schools, either on the Johnson or the Byrd site. There was a bunch of different paths that we could go down. Next, it would be establish some criteria to how you measure those options against one another to come up with what we feel would be the best solutions for the town. Typically, you know, districts create 10 to 12 criteria or so that are most important to a district or a town, and then they begin to evaluate those options. In that process, we also get more information from the design team, from the professionals working on the job, from other committees in town, and start to rate those options and eventually narrow that down to a short list and eventually get down to a single solution, that preferred solution. Next slide. So you may have seen this slide before. This is what I was talking about, those 7 solution scenarios, again, based upon enrollment, 450 at a single school or 905 in a combined school. And you can see the different solution paths that were available when we started this project, whether it was renovating the existing all the way up to building a new school, either on the Byrd or the Johnson site. The town had determined prior to the project that really the Byrd and the Johnson site were potentially the 2 only viable options for sites in town. A lot of the other sites either were too small or had severe restrictions that precluded possibly building a school of this size on it. So we looked at strictly the Johnson and the Byrd site. And of these 7 paths, basically 19 concepts were created, all dealing with different types of enrollment, whether 450 or 905. So we came up with 19 original concepts based on these solution scenarios. And this is an example of putting all those concepts together. So this was a combination of effort between TAPE and Compass and the building committee, coming up with all the different possible options, a straight renovation of Byrd for just a single school, all the way up to a new school for a combined enrollment on the Johnson site, a new school on the Byrd site, 19 different options, conceptual budget estimates, possible phasing sequences, durations of construction, and whether or not we thought that these options were really feasible or not. This list was submitted to the MSBA as part of the PDP submittal, and then a little bit narrowed down following that submittal with some options that weren't really feasible in the long run for a variety of reasons. So we ended up with about 12 or 13 options coming out of PDP. And those 19 options, and as far as costs, one of the criteria that they had was the cost associated with construction. And they ranged anywhere from roughly $47 million to renovate the Byrd School, basically just bring it up to code, really not a renovation as far as finishes go, but just make sure all the systems in the code and the accessibility items were upgraded. Anywhere up to almost $97 million for a combined school of 905 students. So there was you can kind of see the range of costs based on what the possible solution path would have been. We did a pretty in-depth dive into some of the financials related to a combined school or a single school in the previous forum. And then I'll turn it over to Dr. Goff to talk a little bit about the enrollment decision, because that was really the first major decision that helped to narrow down the options.
Thanks, Brian. As Brian mentioned that on December 10th, the school committee voted, and it was a unanimous vote to pursue combined middle school enrollment. So we look at that enrollment as 905 for the project. And the rationale behind that, which is also outlined and detailed in the educational plan. For one, and most importantly, it comes down to equitable access. That each student, and what does that mean? That each student receives the resources and educational opportunities to learn and thrive. So we're looking at equity in terms of resource allocation, and 100% of the students benefiting from resource allocation at a new school. That can mean equitable access to 21st century learning environments and programming, technology access, technology literacy and computer science labs. We look at our multimedia and video production labs, robotics, performance areas, athletic fields. We also looked at improved and more equitable access to student services. So having all of our middle school in-district programs in one building instead of having to leave their neighborhood school and go to a program. This way we have one neighborhood, one school. Improved ability to team teach. We talked about how teaming is at the heart of our middle school philosophy, and our grades 6 through 8 programming should be delivered as such. And for some of you that may be familiar with middle school, that there tends to be, due to logistics, some cross teaming where teachers are teaching more than one grade level. So this really would help deter that and not have cross teaming, and being able to group students in clearly defined teams, and also having academic and these grade level neighborhoods to help with not only academic, but social and emotional learning. One of the others is improved ability. We talked about for teachers to support students and the ability for them to have to collaborate instead of collaborating between buildings. And then also you can see in this bullet point, improved school programming and related arts offering. So a combined middle school really allows us to utilize our staff to offer more robust related arts curriculum. Currently, due to the staffing and our space constraints, it's limited in capacity. So a consolidated school allows us to offer more programs during the school day and after school, our extracurricular activities and clubs that may not be able to run right now due to enrollment. And then when you look at the last bullet, we talked about it being more cost effective than having separate building projects. So if we have a separate building project, it could be greater than 10 years to complete a second project with MSBA funding. So just some of the rationale for a combined middle school.
Thanks, Bridget. So that first decision on enrollment was really the key to start narrowing down options. And obviously when the decision was made to go with a consolidated school, it eliminated all of the single school option paths. So the bird only option paths were eliminated. And then in addition to that, the renovation of the Johnson school to be large enough to house a combined school really was deemed to be not practical, given some of the site constraints of where the existing Johnson is located. From a site circulation and even just proximity to the VFW and things of that nature, that option was chosen not to move forward. So it really left us with 3 paths, adding on and renovating the existing bird school, building a new building somewhere on the bird site, and then building a new building possibly on the Johnson site. So it ended up with a total of 6 conceptual options. As I mentioned, we have to carry 1 addition renovation option forward for the MSBA. We ended up with 4 possible options on the bird site, and we ended up with 1 possible option or feasible option on the Johnson site for a total of 6. And to talk a little bit more in detail about those options, Chris Blessing from TAPE will walk us through it.
Thanks, Brian. So we'll run through all of the options, and then I think we'll show you how those were shortlisted, and then you'll see kind of a comparison side by side of the current shortlisted options. But these will just be sort of a high level review of all of the options that were considered as part of the first round, and a quick review, and then we can go into the others more specifically. So this first one you see here is the option BR2, which is the bird renovation that encompasses the entire population for the combined school. And so 905 students, and what you see in the yellow boxes that are attached to the lighter the lighter color footprint for the existing bird is really where the additions would be. And so, yeah, we're proposing that we could add on to the building and in a sort of systematic way and expand some classrooms on the sides and try to achieve as much of the program as we possibly can. But as you can see with the timing and the evaluation matrix later, a substantial renovation like this comes at, the cost is a little bit more, and the disruption to the school during construction is a little bit more challenging. So you can go to the next slide. So the other option for the bird site is this one, which is, we're calling it option B1. And this is a new building that does completely miss the existing bird. So this can be built and constructed around the existing school. And so that creates a better scenario for teaching and learning on site during construction. We can separate the two activities, construction activities and learning activities, and then effectively flip the site when the new building is done, and then demolish the bird and finish the site work. You can go to the next option. This option was another new option that we were looking at for the bird site, and the major difference here beyond just the form or shape of the building is that it would have to be phased, because you can see right above where it says buses, there's a little indicator on the box for the gym that says phase 3, and we would not be able to build that until we demolished the existing bird building. And so we would have to build all of the academic components to the building, and then tear down the bird, and then build the gym, and then you could finish the construction. And so that has a lot of phasing logistics requirements to it to achieve that building there. So that's just some of the nuances around B4. You can go to the next slide. B5 was another option that is all combined population for the for one middle school in Walpole. And this one kind of stretches the building in a long sort of linear model, stretching from Washington Street on the east towards the existing bird school on the west. And one of the big challenges to this project became the grading. So there's a quite significant hill when you think in terms of a flat building, floor plates, the hill that goes up from the bird towards Washington Street doesn't feel all that significant when you're in a car, but when you study it from a building perspective, it becomes a bit of a challenge to make that work. And so that was one of the differentiators about this option. You can go to the next slide. And then we studied an option for putting it on the flat side of the bird, which is more on the East Street side of the property, and just taking over some of the fields over there. And the study of this was really to try and figure out how much or how little space we could actually take up with the footprint of the building in order to maintain as much field space as possible, just given that the town has just invested recently, a good chunk of money on creating these fields. And so we wanted to make sure that we, made as compact as a footprint as we could. And that would reduce the burden on the project to replicate fields somewhere else in town. You can go to the next slide. And then we had two options on the Johnson site. This is one of those options. And you can see where we were trying to site this up on the higher portion of the site, which is in terms of north, it's the northern part of the site, but it's also on the top of the plateau there, a little hill. It's almost maybe around 50 feet higher than where the baseball fields are right now. And it was as far away from the existing building as we could get, but notably, we were also trying to get it as far away from the wells that are on that site as we can, because there's some concern around, well, from a permitting perspective, you might be able to see the faint orange line, orange circles there that kind of go over the fields and on the sort of top left side of the picture. We can't build inside of those at all. And there's also some heavy restrictions even outside of that as we build the building. But so we were trying to site this building as far away from those as we can, because it is the source of some of the town's water. You can go to the next slide.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
So another thing I'll note is that a lot of the concepts that you saw were just kind of the general strategy concepts. Obviously, the shapes of the building will change over time. The circulation patterns will change over time. But the goal was really seeing, based on the square footage requirements of a potential new building, if a square footage would fit, like a first floor would fit, and you could fit in parking, you could fit in circulation. So that's kind of what those options represent. Obviously, we don't expect the shapes of those buildings to remain the same, but just so you have a general idea. So once we had those options available, as I mentioned before, the school building committee established criteria to which to compare those options against, adding in some additional research and information such as pricing and timing and duration and construction durations, peripheral costs, non-construction costs, those things, again, at a conceptual level, and kind of started to weigh those different options against one another. Next slide. And they prioritized 12 evaluation criteria for the project. And they reviewed all 6 options against that criteria and started to rate those concept options. And those criteria included things like supportive education programs and goals. With a new building, a new construction building, you have a very good opportunity to kind of design the building to meet your educational needs. Maybe not so much in a renovated building. And then obviously, the smaller the school was not even an option at this point. Total project cost, so that includes things like not only the construction cost, but the cost of the architect, the cost of project management, soft costs, which is associated with furniture and technology related to the school, and also things like swing space. So options that included renovations to the existing building, or possibly phased construction where you had to maybe bring in potentially temporary classrooms to move kids around. Like, those are types of costs that need to get captured, and they go into the total project cost. And also the contingency. So you have a construction contingency on a project, which is related to things like change orders that might come up during construction. And then an owner's contingency for some of those softer peripheral costs that might change over time. And obviously, the more expensive the construction cost, typically the contingency rises as a reflection or as a percentage of those costs. So we gathered all that up. An estimate of construction costs, how long we thought the construction might last, affects how expensive it could be, how many phases it has, the different type of site work that might need to happen on a particular site. Do you need to create temporary parking lots as part of the construction project? Things of that nature got rolled into construction cost. Any special or atypical site work costs, like we didn't expect to find any ledge, but did you have additional grading to do, as Chris mentioned on that B5 option, as far as digging into the hillside at Bird to maybe level the site or deal with a sloping grade? Do you need to do field restoration, things of that nature? Potential and eligible costs was a big one. This is something that relates to dealing with the MSBA. So the MSBA eventually will formalize an agreement with the town to reimburse a certain percentage of eligible costs on this project. However, not all costs associated with the project are eligible per the MSBA guidelines. They have certain caps on construction costs. For instance, site work, they cap that typically at about 8%. So 8% of the construction cost goes to site work. If you're above that site work cap, they could deem some of that site work, even though it's necessary for the job, they could deem it to be ineligible because it's above the cap. They also deem things like temporary classrooms or anything related to moving as ineligible. So obviously projects that might have that associated with it might have more potential for ineligible costs than others. Construction duration, pretty simple. How long was construction going to take? A new building all alone on its own field could possibly go faster than maybe a phased renovation where you're moving kids around classrooms and can't get into certain parts of the building until the kids are moved. Impact to the existing school, a big concern. Construction, whether it's on the building itself that the kids are currently in operation with, or whether it's next to the school. What could be that potential impact for those options? Impact to the existing athletic fields was deemed as a criteria. Obviously, you're going to have possibly the fields offline during construction, and you could also have durations of maybe recreating those fields if necessary somewhere else, where you could displace programs, both school and town programs, while those fields are out of operation. Impact to traffic, this is a big one. Obviously, we're combining middle school, so you're going to send half of the middle school population currently to one side of the town or the other, and you'll have to deal with that and some of the impacts. How do those options deal with that? Impact to natural habitats and environment. What are some of the natural resources and the surrounding environment that might be impacted by any of these options? And then how does it fit into long-range town planning and future expansion? What can the town do with either one of the remaining buildings? What can they do with the remaining site spaces? If you had to expand the school for any reason in the future, obviously you don't build brand new school buildings all the time. So this could be a 30, 40 year investment. If you need to expand it, you have room on the site. Are you putting the building in a location that you could do that effectively if you had to? So they put all those criteria in place, created a matrix for conversation and to start ranking with the options across the top, those criteria down the left. And they started to rank based on discussions and feedback and information that they were receiving. Green being a better option, light green being a good option, yellow kind of being an average or a neutral option, fair being there's some issues, and red possibly being a poor option where you might have a lot of issues related to that. They looked at all of those criteria that Chris went through, BR2, B1, B4, B5, B6, and the Johnson option J2. And on their meeting on the 5th, narrowed that down to 3 options. Next slide. And what came out of that, those deliberations and multiple passes through that matrix and grading and regrading of those options was a selection of 3 shortlisted options. BR2, which is an add renovation to the existing Bird Middle School. B1, which is the new building in front of the Bird Middle School, closer to Washington, between Bird and Washington Street, but not up on the hill closest to Washington Street. And then a potential new building at the Johnson site. Next slide. So these are the 3 shortlisted options that are currently under consideration by the building committee. They are looking to make a decision on one option to move forward at their meeting on the 26th. Since the meeting on the 5th, we've been doing a lot of due diligence on these individual options, getting more information, meeting with other town representatives, other town boards, getting more feedback, and obviously hosting the community forum tonight. And the goal is to get enough information that the building committee feels informed that they can make a decision on the 26th to pick one of these and move it forward. With that, we'll open it up to questions or comments, and we'll try to answer them as best as we can. Hopefully we've answered some of the questions we already got in the chat during the presentation, but we'll go from there. Tony, do you want to run with those?
I have them. I see
got
them right now. Sure. Let's see. This may be a part of tonight's program, but I'm interested in the site option that appears to site a building in a wooded area near the town aquifer adjacent to the current Johnson Middle School.
You want me to answer that, Brett?
Sure.
Or do you want to? Do you want to, Ryan, or do you want me to?
Yeah, you can, Chris, and I can chime in if you'd like.
Okay, sure. Whoever's running the slides, you might show the J2 option, and we can talk through that as a live example. But yeah, the J2 option is the one that is referenced there in that question, and it's so here you can.
Wait 1 second.
Yeah, it should be the next slide. The other way.
Yep.
There you go. Oh,
There you go.
There you go.
all right.
All right. Yeah. So this is the J2 option, and it does propose the building be in that wooded area again, like I kind of explained on the plateau of the building. And so, yes, it is. I think the Water and Sewer Commission has done some measuring, and they estimate that this building's facade would maybe be somewhere around, a little over 700 feet from the well. Those orange circles are 400-foot buffers that you can't build in, and then there's some other zone restrictions that are called Area 1 or Zone 2s, which are basically influence areas to the wells and the aquifer underneath the site, and so kind of recharge areas. And so we've seen schools built in recharge areas before, and what the DEP does is basically has you ramp up the underground retention and recharge systems for the project, and so some of that cost has been taken into the estimates here. But there are other questions raised by sewer and water. You might have watched the conversation with the select board that was held last night. And so I think that this is the option that question is referring to. And I don't know if there's specific points beyond what we're showing or have already discussed, but I just wanted to highlight that this is that option.
All right, back to the chat. Why is the building on Johnson site about 5% less expensive?
I'll take a shot at that. So initially, when we did cost estimates, we were looking at potentially a faster construction duration on the Johnson site than maybe some of the other options. Obviously, there's less, not phasing, but kind of site setup and site moving around on the Johnson site, as it's detached from the bird. It's not affecting the bird school, and it's kind of not affecting the Johnson school. So that's really the biggest driver at this point. And even though it does have, some tree clearing that would need to be done, there's not as much grading on the Johnson site conceptually as there might be on some of the other bird sites. But the biggest driver was really potential for maybe a shorter construction duration on the Johnson site.
Okay, and I know there are questions in the Q&A, and I'll get to those. Are there examples in the greater Boston area of towns similar to size to Walpole, and Walpole's actual population, that have 900 middle school students served by a single middle school?
I have that chart that we had, if you want me to share that with all the different towns with the numbers.
Sure.
Yeah, I think we had presented that at maybe a prior community forum as well.
So this is a list of schools with similar population to Walpole in the 25,000s. Enrollments are down the middle school enrollment column on column E. And you can see Walpole's number 6 going across, and you can see similar schools of the same size. Around 905 is Marshfield, Middleborough 783, Dedham 674, Easton 877, Hingham Middle 999, Galvin, which was a project that we looked at quite a bit with the district as an existing brand new school, 818 in Wilmington. So these are the ones that we were comparing to in enrollment size per middle school enrollments per similar population. So
yeah, and there were others that were larger. We were just the ones that stack up demographically to Walpole. There's a lot of that are very similar. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks. Let me just make sure I'm getting to all the questions. There's a couple questions about traffic. What is the metric used to differentiate traffic impacts?
You want me to take that, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest one obviously is that the Johnson site conceptually only has one entrance off of Robbins Road that all the traffic would have to funnel through, somewhere on Robbins Road, whereas the bird sites potentially could have an entrance off of East Street, possibly for either parent drop-off or bus drop-off, or a combination that can help alleviate some of that. But Chris, if you want to talk to other aspects of traffic, you can.
Yeah, so we actually do a pretty in-depth traffic study for for the projects when we go about them. Obviously, in a world of COVID where you've got different cohorts coming on different days and things like that, it's really hard to get, like a full count of, average daily trips and stuff like that to a single building. But there are ways to do that engineering and counting, even with the sort of COVID, data that kind of skews it a little bit. Some of the metrics we look at are buses and how many families are using buses in historical data, but how many would be using them in a combined capacity. In the case of Walpole, you may have buses that serve both schools, but you may be able to look at your bus routes and have different results that combine or condense some of the pressure on the transportation systems there. But then we also look at queuing distance on the roads. So like if the queuing around the building gets backed up because of the traffic, where does that impact into the next closest intersection or other adjacent streets? We look at the called site distance. So if you're entering or exiting the site, how far can you see down the road to make site traffic safe for pedestrians walking or any kind of other school activity that's going on. So it's a fairly complicated, look at traffic, and there's a lot of different metrics used. And so, just looking at the two sites right off the bat, you might say that, one is more advantageous than the other in terms of site queuing distance, or one has a better ability, like Brian mentioned, we can enter and exit off of Bird from two main streets or two major streets. So we can send service and bus traffic up one way and cars and parent traffic down another way. And that kind of separates this, most schools, when the buses pull in and open their doors and put the stop sign out, it brings everything to a screeching halt. And you have to wait until they're done, until everything can move again. And so if we can separate those loops, then it helps traffic not get backed up on the main streets and stuff like that. So those are different metrics that we looked at and that we will look at and continue to look at as the project evolves.
Thanks, Chris. And there's also, I just want to read through a couple of the other, traffic concerns so people can, you can hear their feedback. One resident on Stetson Circle said just concerned that relatively small amount of vehicle queuing with J2 would cause significant traffic issues on Rodman Road, just like the other person mentioned, all the way down to the intersection of Pemberton at Route 1A, which already seems at a poor level of service. That was even prior to doubling the student count of the school. And that we have flagged it as a negative, but it seems like you need to pick an option prior to doing a true traffic study. Is there any way to get the traffic study done first? And I'm just going to read a couple more. Not sure how the matrix noting concerns were developed. However, it seems like the impact of traffic and natural resources. So I want to bring in a couple of natural resource comments. For the Johnson site were inadequately evaluated. Were traffic and natural resources studied? And what efforts, in addition to include the abutters of these project sites, were taken? And just to note at the school board meeting last night, the water commissioners voted against Johnson. And this person said, Bird, a new building is the best move. So I don't know if you want to speak to a couple of those things, because traffic seems to be an issue. And then I'll read the other ones, after you respond to that, but also the water commissioner voting against Johnson last night.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So on the matrix that the building committee reviewed in January, getting to a short list, I think the Johnson site had a lower grade for traffic and both environmental impact due to some of the concerns, both for traffic and from the environment, whether it was the water or potentially, obviously cutting more trees than maybe a Bird site. It needed to get some more information, but I think when you looked at the two sites, or the two sites, Bird and Johnson, and how they compared to each other, the Bird site rated more favorably for some of the things we've already talked about, that you had the potential to alleviate some of the traffic concerns maybe better than you could at a Johnson site with a single entrance and maybe less queuing space, and potentially even at Johnson, the need to upgrade more intersections with signalization, especially at 27 and at 1A. So that was taken into effect. And like I said, that's a fluid matrix that's since been updated with the committee last night, and then also part of the meeting with the select board and the water and sewer commission. So there has been a lot of back and forth related to some of the concerns related to the water wells in the area and the zones of influence. So yeah, I think as much information could be gathered has been gathered to kind of understand that there are pros and cons of each site, and that the traffic and the environment impact is definitely a concern on the Johnson site.
And we also have Bill Abbott. I know that he's here if he needs to speak to anything in terms of the water.
If anyone has any questions, I am available to answer them related to water.
Okay. I'm gonna get to the Q&A piece and bounce back and forth, but I just want to make sure these couple of people are, how seriously are you considering a renovation in addition on the existing bird site? Do you think taxpayers will support that? So maybe Brian or Chris, you can talk about the reimbursables versus what's not reimbursed due to what would happen during an ad reno.
Yeah, I'll start with that. So
Yeah.
the MSBA requires an addition renovation option to be carried forward in the PSR stage. So it's one of the requirements that we have to bring that option forward, and we have to study it further. So that remains on the matrix. One of the things, our experience that we typically find is that although, potentially, people think that, ad renovation should be less expensive, and it is somewhat less expensive. Maybe from the renovation cost, like the renovation construction cost per square foot could be a little bit lower than new construction cost per square foot. However, one of the things that showed up on the matrix, and we broke down the cost comparison, is that the renovation would require a lot of that additional project costs, like temporary classrooms or swing space, or however we wanted to address, how do you renovate that school while it's in operation? And by doing so, that most likely will extend the time it takes to actually get that project completed. I know Chairman Breen has lived through a few school renovations while they were occupied, and they're not very neat, and they often take longer than a new construction where you just start the building and finish the building. So at the end of the day, that presumed less expensive ad reno option doesn't necessarily end up being all that less expensive than a new building. So from a final perspective, I think the building committee will weigh all those options and move forward with what they think is the most economical and cost benefit option.
Can you talk about, since we're mentioning Bird, the new option at Bird being built in front of the existing building? Does this help the town keep the fields behind the school? And are we able to increase the area at all?
Yeah, it would help you maintain the fields that you currently have, and then where the existing bird is right now, it's actually going to leave a fairly decent hole in the site when we tear it down. That would be replaced with parking lots mostly, but there might be an opportunity to maybe squeak out a little bit more area for play on the fields. I don't want to underplay in answering that question the significance around grading the site. It's really elusive with the bird site, that it looks flat and kind of gentle, but then when you try to put large program elements like fields and buildings on it, it becomes a pretty interesting constraint. If you go walk around out there, I think you might see that. So I think yes, there's an opportunity, and we would definitely be trying to study that and maximize the green space play area on the site that we can. So.
And then before I go to the Q&A, and maybe Bill Abbott, you could speak to this, environmental issues on the Johnson site are paramount. And then we did talk about the traffic on Robbins Road is already complicated by traffic to the train station and access to 27. As we know, Elm Street traffic has significant difficulty accessing Route 27 at this point, and visibility from Robbins Road to Pemberton, is also compromised. But maybe the environmental issues keep coming up. So Bill, since you're here, can you talk about that piece with the water, because that seems to be coming up looking through the thread?
Yes, I can. As was mentioned earlier, the Sewer and Water Commission did vote 3-0-0 to oppose the location of the new middle school at the Johnson site. The main issue is the closeness to the Minebrook 1 and Minebrook 1A wells. When you take that 400-foot radius around the wells, which is very restrictive by DEP. The only thing that is allowed there is to maintain the existing well and passive recreation. And then the school is basically 300 feet beyond that 400-foot radius. And primarily our concern is that adding a 3-story, 170,000 square foot building plus parking lot wasn't appropriate in a location that the zone 1, you're only 300 feet away from a very restrictive area of the municipal wells, as I mentioned, Minebrook 1 and Minebrook 1A. The concerns being potential for contamination and also large impervious surface that's going to result as a result of the building and the associated parking lot.
Thank you. There is the question, again, what effect will the JMS plan have on the surrounding woods? And again, we talked about traffic, the environmental concerns at the Johnson site. So what effect will the plan have on the surrounding woods at the Johnson site? And what are any additional environmental concerns at the Johnson site?
The effect on the woods would be significant. Like we can't underplay that, you know, it's got to be cleared to build a building, you know? So I think there's a significant effect to the woods, and I think the environmental concerns have been, I think, largely discussed. They're mostly around water issues, as far as I know. I don't know that there's other, I mean, aside from the environmental impacts of you know, clear cutting trees in a forest. I think that the water is the next paramount concern there. So environmentally speaking.
If I could just add, in addition to being close to the 400-foot radius, which is basically a no-touch zone, where the bulk of the water is drawn is from the Zone 2 area, and this is going to be sitting on top of the Zone 2. So that being close to the well, and also it's going to be sitting on, you know, where the bulk of the water is drawn from.
Okay. Someone said, are we all aware of the Bay Circuit Trail that traverses the woods behind, you know, the VFW?
Yeah, we noted that, and I think that would have to be taken into consideration. If the Johnson site was a final site, we would have to definitely plan around those and try to incorporate that trail as much as we could. So
Yeah, I think in general, the Johnson site, you know, while it's feasible and schools have definitely been built in similar areas, again, maybe not as close as this school is located to, as other towns have done, that solution would have to address all of the issues that we talked about tonight. So it'd have to address how to deal with, you know, mitigating or eliminating potential risk to the water. Obviously, you're clear cutting that site to build a building. There'd be a significant planting plan associated with that to try to reestablish that, but you do need to clear space for that building. You'd have to do some type of rerouting of a bait trail if that's necessary, and possibly tie all that site together. So that would impact, you know, that Johnson solution above and beyond some of the initial costs that we've already developed.
Would the Johnson site option be cheaper or easier to work if the town negotiated to move the VFW?
from a planning perspective, I think it would open up some other possible solutions that could put more of the building outside of that Area 1, Zone 2 that Bill has been talking about, and that the Water Commission has voiced their concern about. So I think, yes, that could make that a reality. But the question of cheaper, I don't think it would be cheaper, because you'll probably find that the negotiation with VFW would add costs to the town in some form or fashion. And those probably wouldn't be insignificant.
A couple of people have asked that if the site is built to Bird, that the Johnson site will have the JMS building remaining. So one question asked, will this site be used for the middle school program, or with any of the options, like would the town consider, what would happen to that building?
Yeah, part of the process will the town will have to most likely undergo studying whatever building is remaining to decide what is the best use for that, if that can house other town programs, or if there's a potential rental option or something of that nature. But yeah, they will have to study what to do with that building, or one of the buildings.
So if fall town meeting happens and it does not approve the recommended plan, what happens at that point in the MSBA process? Does the town then have to go and reapply, or can the town go ahead and vote on a different plan? Like going back, and it says just addressing the Bird School, how do we continue? How does that process work?
It's not an easy process, because basically you're putting all of your design efforts and estimating efforts and costing efforts leading towards one solution. So you have to have a similar amount of information available for a second option, which is typically not brought forward, obviously, with current schedules and budgets. The MSBA does give some time for a town to possibly do a revote. However, switching out to a totally different option probably is not practical, simply because you wouldn't have the same information available that was presented at the town meeting for the first option. And therefore, if the town can't approve it within, I believe it's like 45 days beyond the initial town meeting, the MSBA basically closes the project and you have to reapply, and you go back to basically as if you had never applied again, and it could take you years to get accepted.
Thanks, Brian. I think that's an important point, and that was a good question asked, because it is a long process. There's a lot of hard work involved, and when we take it to a vote, that's what we want. We want it to pass. Is there any data or follow-up studies with towns who decided to add on or renovate existing buildings versus those who started new? Are the ones who renovated, are they still happy with their decision, or do they regret not starting from scratch? I have one example of that, so I can talk after you, Brian, after visiting different middle schools.
If you
Chris
want
is
to,
actually working
Sure.
on one now.
So we visited a lot of new middle schools that were built throughout, obviously pre-COVID, and from Situate to some of the buildings that Tapé has done. One particular one that we were fortunate to go out to was to visit Braintree, and one of the middle schools had a reno, and then the other middle school is a new building. And what was interesting is talking to the principal there, who was former assistant principal at Bird Middle School, Mr. Damon Rainey, indicated that the renovation was really difficult. And when they looked at doing the new building, they found it was more cost effective, but they just wouldn't go through a reno again. It was nothing short of being extremely difficult, having to do a reno while the students are in school. Had to field a lot of phone calls about, what was going on in the halls, the dust going in the halls, safety concerns. It was really, really difficult. They said, I think they said they would never do it again.
and I'll add to that, there are a lot of districts that do add renovations, and a lot of them are land-strapped districts. I mean, Newton, Brookline are examples. However, what advantages that some of those towns and cities have is that they actually have older buildings that are offline that they keep as swing space, and they're able to move entire schools. Like when they do their elementary school, they move an elementary school into this old swing space school that they use strictly for their construction projects, and they renovate or add reno that existing school all at once. So they really limit the impact, other than moving to obviously a different school for a year or two. They minimize that impact. So a lot of towns don't have that luxury. and you have to do a phased, occupied renovation. We did a renovation at Medway Middle School, kind of a similar scenario where you're renovating and building a portion of the building, you're moving kids around, you're adding on a piece here, you're moving kids to this section of the classroom for this, for this semester. And at the end of the day, if it's the right decision for the town, on a lot of different reasons, it's the right decision. But for the kids and the staff that go through that, it's not necessarily the best experience, but it can be done. And I think if most people have had their options, they would rather say, I'd rather not be impacted and have a new space at the end of the day. So however you can do that the best is usually the best solution.
There was a comment to look at the history of the high school. Maybe we could have had a new school for all the time, money, and then just, bringing that up to date. Let me see if there's anything else in the chat before I go back. Just one comment, just a proponent of the combined middle school, to just note that this person said, I'm a longtime middle school teacher. My previous job was teaching in a school with 350 students, and my current job in a neighboring town of Walpole is a middle school with 875 students. I would much rather send my child to a larger middle school because you have so many more options. At a 350 student school, you don't have scheduling options. You can't take advanced math or be in certain special education programs. One larger school helps with that. And middle school teachers are great using teams to build community. I think our students would only benefit from a larger school. So thank you. And I'm seeing if there's any, I don't have any left in the Q&A. So far we are good.
Okay.
Anything else that any school committee members want to add? Sean?
Thank you. Just a quick question. So there's been a lot of talk about the traffic and potential water and sewer issues, but it's also meant that there's costs, also said that there's costs built into the project already to mitigate or address some of those issues. I'm just wondering if there are, on the Johnson site specifically, are there solutions out there that would mitigate, all of these concerns? Or is this, more so just something that would, plug a hole in a dam and, the water issue would become significant, or the traffic issues would continue to grow? Or is that just a unknown at this point?
I think from a planning perspective, the concern of siting a building that close to a well will never go away. And I think that, and the reason I say that is because the concerns that the Water and Sewer Commission brought up are very valid, and things to consider is that when you have anything that's within that close to the place where you get your water from, you shouldn't approach that with a quick, easy decision, right? And so I think there are ways to put money into a project that can adequately recharge the aquifer, like capture water from any impervious additions that we put on the site. We can capture that water and then recharge that into the soils, and virtually balance the site. So when they talk about balancing the site, it's saying, we're not sending it off into the street and then down to some water treatment plant or something. We're capturing it on site, filtering it through the soils, and letting it naturally make its way back into the aquifer. We can do that through modern engineering, and lots of projects do that. So the concern about recharge is, yes, there's ways we can put money at that and recharge the water. Now, but when you talk about water quality and the concerns around potential toxins or contaminations and stuff like that, or a building just being too close to a well, and the sort of not same ideas, that project is proposing that you cut down a large area of forest, and we can't instantly plant 40-foot tall trees somewhere and change that scenario with money, right? So I think that there are some things that we can do to offset some of the concerns, but they don't completely go away. And I think the water ones and the wellheads are concerns that need to be at least gone into with eyes wide open so that you know what your problem is there.
Right, and I'll add to Chris. I mean, you can mitigate potential traffic impacts of, you could add most likely signalization at a couple of those intersections so that people can get in, get out. But obviously that's going to impact, downstream of that as you at the Johnson site as you head closer to the center. The other thing that you can't really change about the Johnson site is you can't change an additional entrance to that location for the most part. I mean, everything has to come off of Robbins Road in some form or fashion. So you can't create those other entrances. The other thing that maybe, that also I don't know if we talked about specifically is, from a exterior element to the school curriculum, if the field remains in place at Johnson that's currently there, that's obviously not quite the same caliber as the fields at Byrd for whether it's gym class or extracurricular activities or things like field day. Is it necessary then to create additional field space, in the site of that building for just the middle school, use? And now you're talking about potentially extra costs on that too. So again, it's all feasible. It's just how many of those items would you need to mitigate potentially to maybe address all of those items? I think our initial concepts was, could you fit a building up there? Is it feasible? Yes. And then you have a couple of these other, avenues that you need to go down to address all those questions and concerns.
Bill, did you have a comment?
Yes, you brought up the fields. I just want to make sure folks are aware. Basically, the entire field is within the 400-foot radius of the Minebrook 1 and 1A wells, and there can't be any fertilization, no irrigation. There is quite a big difference between the fields over at the Byrd School versus what essentially weeds for the Johnson Middle site. And there's really nothing that's going to be able to be done about that as long as the well's there. And the DEP won't allow you to do fertilization, irrigation, and the sort of normal upkeep that you see over at the Byrd site.
That's a good point, Bill. And I think that I'll just speak for the team and say that we try to account for that in the matrix by, we actually downgraded the educational adequacy of that specific option because it really puts a constraint on the district's ability to run outdoor programs in classrooms on the site. And if you're running them in a dirt lot or a mud pit, some days probably, it really constrains the educational response to the physical side of learning, right? And so I think that is a good point, and you said it well, and I just wanted to validate that by saying we've taken that into consideration on that side as well.
Thanks. Just another question about the VFW. Am I correct that the building on the Johnson site would require moving the VFW? It may be a hard sell at town meeting for the combined middle school to pass that the entire VFW has to move to make Johnson feasible, and that just adds to the complexity. Would it make more sense to choose Byrd if it doesn't require buildings to be moved?
Currently, the way that the Johnson site option is situated, it does not require the moving of the VFW building. It works around that. The VFW building's on its own parcel and site, so we worked around that. So currently it is not in the option.
Okay. Are we looking to make the chosen project energy efficient?
Yes. Your town is, I believe, recently entering into some green communities agreements and things like that. And so that helps the building become more energy efficient. But you also, with the MSBA, will get additional reimbursement points for doing would basically equates to LEED Silver, which, if you know anything about the LEED accreditation system, is fairly comprehensive. And with the actually this year, with the start of 2021, all the energy codes increased, which means that beating those by the percentage that LEED Silver requires is a pretty intense task. So, so yeah, the building will be tuned and ready for energy efficiency. It may not at the outset have solar panels or something like that on top of it, but it will be ready for that should the town decide to do that at some point, either part of this project or later. So yes, we're looking to make the building very efficient. So
Thanks, Chris. Can someone talk about Jack Fisher's comments from yesterday's meeting about the fact that the existing Johnson School is in Zone 1, and this new building would move the existing toxins created by the existing school further away and would actually create a better solution than what we have today? Bill?
Yes, that is correct that the existing school is probably feet away from actually being in Zone 1. It actually isn't. The tennis courts are, and you would be moving it from, as I said, basically feet away to 700 feet away from the well. Our thought, the Sewer and Water Commission, was you're correct. The Birds site is even further away and doesn't have any of these concerns and seems like a viable site. And by going there, you eliminate the issues with the water as well as the fields. So.
Okay, thank you. And someone made a comment that the town owns the VFW site. Is the anticipated student size 905 and size of project taking into account natural population growth in the town, as well as the 300 unit complex coming to South Walpole?
Yes, Bridget, do you want to answer that based on your
Sure.
eligibility report?
Right, so we do have to complete a detailed eligibility report that we work with, Compass, and then also Jim Johnson, town administrator, along with Patrick Shield, Mike Frisha. It's a very comprehensive report that we have to complete. And in that is, yes, in a nutshell, it's all the population growth and future population growth. And it does include any and all the unit complexes coming to South Walpole and any other places that might be in the works.
Yeah, the MSBA requires that population study. They look at state trends. They look at Department of Education trends. They look at major and planned construction in the district. And they come up with the, kind of the equation that equates to what a potential enrollment could be. And that's how they come up with those numbers with some type of, growth margin factored into that. So yes, those complexes were addressed.
And I just want to see if there's anything else in the Q&A. In speaking about traffic concerns, pedestrians included, as it pertains to the Johnson site, would the town have to seek permission from MassDOT to signalize the intersection of Route 27 and Robbins Road?
let me read that question. I'm expecting it. Yeah, so state routes for 27 would be included in that. Would have to go through an approval process with MassDOT to signalize, whether that's a pedestrian signal or an actual traffic signal. And so that would be part of the process, and they may have other constraints or requirements when you go through that process that are, that includes things up or down the road in certain ways. But in my experience, and Brian, I don't know if you guys have had experience with this, but in my experience, they typically, I haven't seen them object strongly to things before. They just end up making the timeline a little bit more challenging because it takes a while to get through that process. So,
yeah, Yeah, we've dealt with state agencies on a lot of different levels on many projects. And you just have to factor that into the permitting and also into the construction phase.
All right, let me do one more quick check. What harm, if any, has the current JMS site done to the aquifer? Is there any mention of toxins? Well, there was mention, I'm sorry, there was mention of toxins.
I can take that there. At this
Great.
point, we have not had any problems at the with the Johnson Middle School, the current school. You know, the concern is, as they say, there's always that potential, and you're adding a lot of impervious surface in the area. I would add that, you know, there might have been a significant issue of citing the current site, this current school, which was built in 1966, I believe, with the well already being there. It was built in 1954. The zone and our town aquifer bylaws came into being in the early 1980s. So you probably would have had an even more issue of the siting of the current Bird School, Johnson School, had it been done with the existing regulations that we have now.
Thank you. And that's all the questions and comments we have. I would also just urge people, again, if you want to share, continue to share your viewpoint, your preference, any questions along the way, please go to that. You can just, it's the middle school project. It's all one word at walpole.k12.ma.us. So it's middle school project, all one word, at, like everything else is in the schools district, walpole.k12.ma.us. Anything else, Brian? We good? Tony, Chris?
That's great.
Okay. Is this being recorded? Yes, Walpole Cable's recording it. And we'll make it available. I just have one more before we go. Has the egress from Robbins Road been factored in, such as the width and steepness of Pemberton Street, the Neponset River Bridge at the intersection of North and 1A, and the Railroad Bridge at Sharp Turn on 27?
Good. Chris, you want to?
Yeah. Yeah, we'll have to take more looks at this if that becomes a little bit more of a real consideration. And I think when we talk to the building committee next week, we'll hear more about that. But typically the traffic studies start basically on site and then they go down to the nearest sort of major intersections. And so if stuff trickles out of that down further, or I think width could be something that one of the traffic engineers may say we need to add a lane, you know, to the right or something like that, or right at the school we need to expand something or something like that. We've had projects take those things into consideration before. So I think, again, we're sort of looking at a high level. The traffic engineers already have studies from previous work that's been done in town, both around the Robbins Road area and then at the Bird as well. So we have some data that was pre-COVID, thank goodness. And now we will have some data around the COVID scenario. And so the solutions would lie in sort of the engineering of it. I've answered that fully.
Thank you. Well, thanks, everybody. And again, feel free to keep your comments coming and questions, and we'll make sure that we'll get back to you if at the end, if you had some questions that weren't answered, but I think we were able to get them all. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.